She was cleaning his mansion for Pennies, until he found out who she really was. The mansion stood as a cold monument to Daniel Foster's wealth, power, and deep-rooted isolation. Its towering walls seemed to stretch into the sky, an imposing structure surrounded by pristine gardens that never saw the wear of human footsteps. Inside, the rooms were filled with expensive decor that glittered and gleamed under the heavy chandeliers, casting long shadows over the marble floors. The air was thick with silence, a silence that only amplified the chill that hung in every corner. There was no warmth to be found in the mansion, not in the cold, pristine furniture, nor in the echo of each footstep on the floors that seemed to reverberate endlessly. To anyone who entered, it was clear that Daniel Foster had built this home as much to flaunt his success as to retreat from everything that truly mattered. He surrounded himself with luxury not to celebrate, but to shield himself from the emotions he never allowed himself to feel. His obsession with work and maintaining control had left him emotionally distant, unable to forge any real connection with another human being, let alone those who worked in his home. To Daniel, the mansion was more than a house. It was his fortress, a place where the world could not touch him, where his vulnerabilities could remain hidden behind the cold, immaculate walls. Across town, Emma Hayes lived a life far removed from such luxury. A young woman with no particular distinction, Emma worked multiple jobs just to make ends meet. Her brother's illness weighed heavily on her, not just emotionally, but financially. The constant cycle of doctors' visits and medical bills felt suffocating, and each paycheck seemed to disappear as quickly as it arrived, leaving little hope for anything more than survival. Emma had never been afforded the luxury of dreaming. Her reality was filled with the harshness of responsibility. Yet, she was no stranger to sacrifice. It had become her way of life. When the opportunity arose to work as a cleaner in Daniel's mansion, Emma had been hesitant at first, unsure of how she would fit into such a starkly different world. But the pay, though low, offered a glimpse of something else, a chance to escape her harsh reality, even if just for a few hours a day. The mansion's grandiose walls, its ornate rooms, and its quiet, perfect stillness seemed worlds away from the cluttered, noisy life Emma knew. She wasn't naive enough to think she would find happiness there, but she did wonder, if only for a fleeting moment, whether there was a way to change her life. Emma's first days in the mansion were a mix of awe and disbelief. The grand halls felt as though they belonged to a different era, with their portraits of past generations glaring down at her from every corner. As she moved through the rooms, dusting off the immaculate furniture and polishing the glimmering surfaces, she couldn't help but notice the silence that hung in the air, broken only by the sound of her own footsteps. She'd never seen a home like this before, and every time she passed through the marble-floored halls, she felt like a visitor in a world that wasn't meant for people like her. And yet, there was something oddly mesmerizing about it all. The house spoke of power, of control, of a life that was so carefully curated and maintained that it seemed untouchable. There was no warmth to be found in any of it, no life beyond the cold decor, no laughter or conversation to fill the void. Daniel appeared so rarely, his presence nothing more than a fleeting shadow, often passing by without so much as a word. When he did appear, he would issue commands without a hint of emotion, as if he were simply going through the motions. He never acknowledged Emma in any real way, and she couldn't help but wonder how someone could live like that, so disconnected from the world around them, so distant from human connection. Though she worked tirelessly, Emma couldn't help but notice the sadness she occasionally glimpsed in Daniel's eyes when he thought no one was looking. It was brief, fleeting, but it was enough to stir something within her. She had learned to observe the people around her, especially those who, like herself, lived in the shadows of the world. She had become adept at reading the small signals that others missed. And in Daniel, she saw something more than just a wealthy businessman. Beneath the icy exterior, she sensed a deeper sadness, a hidden pain that he kept locked away behind his fortress of wealth. It was strange how she could feel it, how her heart seemed to ache for him, even though she barely knew him. Emma couldn't deny the curiosity that had begun to grow inside her, a silent wonder about the man who seemed to have everything but the one thing that mattered most: connection. Her days at the mansion passed in a blur of cleaning and silent observation. But as time went on, Emma began to notice something else: her own weariness. Each day, she arrived at the mansion early and left late, her muscles aching from hours of cleaning and her heart heavy with worry for her brother. Yet despite the exhaustion that weighed her down, she never complained. Emma had learned early in life that complaining never changed anything, never helped anyone. Still, the physical toll of the work was becoming undeniable, and there were moments when she found herself staring at her reflection in the mirrors of the grand halls, wondering how much longer she could keep going like this. Would her life always be like this? Would she always be the one who sacrificed her happiness for the sake of others? Always the one left behind in the wake of someone else's success? But there was one moment, one small moment, when everything seemed to shift. Emma stood in front of one of the mansion's massive mirrors, wiping down the glass as she had done so many times before, but this time something was different. She caught a glimpse of herself, her tired eyes, her worn hands. The reflection staring back at her was a stark contrast to the woman she had imagined herself to be. She was no longer the hopeful young woman who dreamed of a better life. She was someone who had been worn down by the weight of her responsibilities, someone whose dreams had become so distant that they felt like a memory of another life. In that reflection, Emma saw a woman who was trapped in a cycle she couldn't break, a woman who had given up so much of herself in the pursuit of survival. But as she stood there, staring into her own eyes, something shifted within her. She could feel the spark of change, a quiet question stirring deep inside her. What would it take to change her life? What if she didn't have to be trapped anymore? This moment, small and unspoken, became the first crack in the shell of her self-imposed limitations, the first flicker of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, things. As Emma stood before the mirror, the weight of her exhaustion seemed to dissolve, if only for a moment. The reflection staring back at her no longer seemed like a woman who had accepted her fate, but someone on the verge of something new. She couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. Perhaps it was just the sheer vulnerability of the moment, standing alone in the quiet grandeur of the mansion. But something deep within her stirred, a longing for more than just survival, for more than simply existing. It was the first flicker of desire for a life where she was in control, where her choices mattered, where she wasn't always a spectator to the success and happiness of others. Emma wasn't sure what that life would look like, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself the possibility of change. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. But before she could dive deeper into that thought, the reality of her life hit her again. Her brother's health continued to decline, and each day she watched the weight of his illness drag him further from her. The guilt she felt for not being able to do more, for not being able to give him the life he deserved, gnawed at her constantly. She had no answers, no clear way forward. What could she do? How could she fix everything when everything around her seemed so broken? The mansion, with all its cold beauty, seemed like an entirely different world compared to the chaos of her life, and the distance between them felt insurmountable. The days in the mansion began to blur into one another. Emma cleaned and observed, her thoughts always split between the oppressive silence of Daniel's home and the constant worry for her brother. Yet despite her struggles, she found herself drawn to the mansion in a way she hadn't expected. Each room she cleaned, each task she completed, brought her closer to something unknown, but something that felt as though it could be a key to unlocking her future. Her days there became more than just work. They became moments of reflection. She began to wonder if her brother's illness was somehow connected to her own choices, to the way she had lived her life. Had she gotten so used to sacrificing everything for him that she had forgotten how to dream for herself? And then there was Daniel. He remained an enigma, a man who seemed so far removed from her world, yet one whose presence affected her more deeply than she cared to admit. She couldn't ignore the fact that, beneath his cold exterior, there was something else, something broken, something that mirrored the pain she herself carried. The curiosity that had first sparked within her grew stronger with each passing day. There were moments when Emma saw the slightest cracks in Daniel's stoic facade. A glance, a fleeting expression that hinted at the torment behind his calm demeanor. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her wonder if there was more to him than she could understand. As the days passed, Emma began to feel the first stirrings of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. It was fragile, like a small ember in the dark, but it was there. And for the first time in years, she let herself entertain the possibility that there might be something better waiting for her. Something beyond the struggle, beyond the pain. Maybe, just maybe, the mansion wasn't just a cold fortress. Maybe it was the place where her life and her connection to Daniel could change. Little did she know, the mansion's silent reign was about to be shattered, not by anything that could be seen or touched, but by the quiet, unspoken shifts within her own heart. And as the days went on, she would find herself standing at the crossroads of everything she had ever known and everything she was about to discover. Emma finished her daily routine, wiping down the polished surfaces of the grand staircase, when something caught her attention. There, in the corner of the hallway, was a door she had never noticed before. It was old and weathered, almost hidden behind the intricate design of the wallpaper and the shadows that clung to the corners of the mansion. Her heart skipped a beat as curiosity flooded her chest. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if it was a part of the house that was off limits to the staff. But the pull of mystery was too strong, and Emma found herself turning the doorknob. The room beyond the door was small and dimly lit, a study that had clearly been abandoned for years. Dust hung thick in the air, and the furniture was draped in white sheets, as if the room had been frozen in time. Emma's footsteps echoed eerily in the stillness as she moved further inside, her breath catching in her throat. On the desk in the center of the room were scattered papers, yellowed and brittle with age. As her eyes scanned the desk, one document in particular caught her attention. It was a legal file, slightly crumpled at the edges, with a name she knew all too well. Emma's pulse quickened as she read the name. It was Daniel's estranged wife. The shock of the discovery hit her like a punch to the gut. She had heard rumors about the woman's disappearance, of course, but this document was the first tangible evidence she had ever seen. Emma flipped through the papers, each one offering a glimpse into the mystery surrounding the woman's vanishing. One line in particular stood out, something about a philanthropist's sudden disappearance years ago, a story that had been all over the news at the time. The realization crept over Emma slowly, but once it settled, she couldn't ignore the dark connection. Daniel's wife, his missing wife, was the woman from those headlines. And somehow, Emma couldn't help but feel that this was only the tip of the iceberg. The revelation churned in her mind as she left the hidden room. Her entire understanding of the mansion of Daniel shifted in that moment. She couldn't unsee what she had just learned, nor could she ignore the weight of the secrets buried in the walls of the house. Everything about Daniel's cold, distant persona now felt like a carefully constructed facade, hiding something much darker and deeper. Emma found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about him. What was the truth behind his wife's disappearance? And why had Daniel never spoken of it? The mystery gnawed at her relentlessly, and though she knew it was dangerous to dig deeper, she couldn't stop herself from wanting to know more. Later that day, while Emma was polishing the grand staircase, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up, startled to see Daniel coming toward her. The sight of him was enough to make her heart race, not out of fear, but because of the tension that had begun to hang between them since her discovery. Daniel's gaze met hers, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He had always been indifferent to the staff, but this time, there was a subtle shift in his demeanor. Emma stood still, trying to maintain her professionalism, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Neither of them acknowledged it outright, but the unspoken tension lingered, thick and palpable. Their brief interaction felt more awkward than usual. Emma noticed how Daniel's eyes flickered toward her, a momentary awareness of her presence that wasn't there before. He moved past her without a word, but Emma couldn't ignore the subtle change in his movements. There was a slight hesitation, a quiet recognition that something had shifted. She wondered if he knew that she had uncovered a piece of his past. Did he sense that she now saw him differently? She tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on her task at hand, but the discomfort of that encounter stayed with her, like an unfinished conversation hanging in the air. The mansion, once a place of solitude, now felt like a maze of hidden truths and untold stories, and Emma found herself trapped in its web, unable to escape. As the days passed, Emma found herself unable to shake the images of the legal documents and the secrets they contained. The more she thought about Daniel's past, the more she became consumed by curiosity. She found herself taking longer than necessary to clean areas that she knew Daniel frequented, hoping to catch another glimpse of something that might explain his cold, distant behavior. She began to observe him more carefully, noting the way he interacted with others, or rather the way he didn't. He was always alone, withdrawn, his eyes shadowed with something she couldn't quite place. The walls he had built around himself seemed to be both a refuge and a prison, and Emma couldn't help but wonder what had driven him to this point. Emma noticed the staff's unwillingness to speak about Daniel's personal life. Every time she tried to probe for information, the conversations would quickly turn to neutral topics. It was as if there was a silent agreement among the staff to keep their boss's history off-limits. This only made Emma more determined to uncover the truth. She watched Daniel more closely now, trying to find some clue in his actions or words that would reveal what had happened to his wife, and what had broken him so completely. It wasn't just his wife's disappearance that intrigued Emma. It was Daniel himself. She began to see beyond the polished facade of the successful businessman. She saw a man haunted by grief, a man whose pain had shaped the person he had become. But what had happened to him? What had made him this way? At night, Emma would lie awake, her mind racing with questions. She knew she shouldn't delve deeper, that some mysteries were better left unsolved, but she couldn't stop herself. The more she learned, the more she understood that Daniel's pain was far more complicated than she had initially thought. He wasn't just a cold, emotionless man. He was someone who had been broken long before Emma had entered his life. She found herself wondering if his grief had built the walls around him, or if they were his way of protecting himself from the world. Emma couldn't help but feel a deep, unspoken connection to him, a connection that she hadn't anticipated. She had her own struggles, her own pain, but something about Daniel's story resonated with her. It was as if, despite their differences, they shared a common thread, an inability to truly connect with others, a fear of vulnerability. The more she thought about him, the more she began to understand that his isolation wasn't just a result of his wealth or his status. It was a defense mechanism, a way to shield himself from the emotional turmoil he had never learned to navigate. Emma realized that, in some ways, he was as trapped in his own life as she was in hers. She had always known the weight of responsibility, the pressure to keep moving forward, to keep going even when it felt like everything was falling apart. But Daniel's burden seemed even heavier, a man carrying the weight of past mistakes, unresolved grief, and the fear of being truly seen. Meanwhile, Emma's own life outside the mansion continued to spiral. Her brother's health continued to deteriorate, the medical bills mounting higher with every passing day. Each time she checked her bank balance, a sickening feeling of helplessness washed over her. She couldn't help but wonder if she was ever going to break free from this cycle of sacrifice and despair. The long hours spent cleaning the mansion only added to the exhaustion that constantly gnawed at her. She would collapse in a bed each night, drained both physically and emotionally. But no matter how worn down she felt, she couldn't stop herself from continuing the daily grind. She had no choice. Her brother needed her. Every dollar she earned brought her one step closer to providing the medical care he desperately needed. One particularly difficult night, after cleaning the mansion for hours, Emma found herself standing in front of the grand windows, staring out at the dark, expansive grounds. The mansion felt even colder at night, its silence pressing in on her like a weight. She was overwhelmed with a sense of hopelessness, the mounting pressure threatening to crush her. But then, for the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel something else: resilience. It was a quiet, stubborn determination, something deep inside her that refused to give up. Despite everything, She would keep going. She would find a way to make things work. The world outside the mansion might be chaotic and uncertain, but here, in this silence, she could momentarily escape the crushing weight of her reality. The mansion had become a temporary refuge, a place where she could pretend, even for a few hours, that she wasn't completely overwhelmed by the weight of her life. As the weeks passed, Emma continued to clean the mansion, her presence growing more noticeable to Daniel. He had begun to observe her more closely, too, noticing the subtle changes in her behavior. He saw the way she moved through the house, with a quiet determination that mirrored his own. And he began to see her not just as a cleaner, but as a woman, one with her own burdens, her own struggles. There was something about her that seemed different from the other staff, something that made him wonder if she saw through his carefully constructed walls. And the more he watched her, the more he realized that she wasn't just a passive observer of his life. She was someone who had a quiet strength, a resilience that reminded him of himself in ways he hadn't expected. The tension between them, once subtle and barely noticeable, began to grow. Emma, too, felt it. She found herself drawn to Daniel, despite all the reasons she should keep her distance. She couldn't deny the empathy she felt for him, nor could she ignore the fact that he was someone with a past that mirrored her own in some ways. But she also felt the pull of caution, the need to protect herself from becoming too entangled in his emotional world. She had her own battles to fight, and she couldn't afford to get caught up in someone else's drama. But even as she pulled away, she couldn't help but feel a growing connection between them, one that, whether she liked it or not, was becoming harder to ignore. Emma's curiosity had always been her compass, but now it was leading her into a maze of dark, unsettling truths. While cleaning one of the mansion's forgotten corners, her eyes fell on a crumpled, yellowing newspaper article buried under a stack of old papers. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it, the headline immediately catching her attention: "Wealthy businessman's wife killed in robbery gone wrong." She read through the piece with growing unease, each sentence revealing more questions than answers. The article recounted a supposed robbery at the mansion years ago that had ended in the wife's death, but something about the details felt off. There were inconsistencies, details that didn't quite line up, facts that were vague or left out entirely. The robbery sounded too convenient, and the article's tone had an almost dismissive quality, as if glossing over a deeper, darker truth. As Emma reread it, the feeling of dread seeped into her bones, and she could no longer ignore the growing suspicion that gnawed at her. What if the robbery story wasn't the full truth? What if there was more to the story, a sinister truth Daniel had been hiding all this time? The more Emma thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. She had seen Daniel's guarded demeanor, the way he avoided talking about his wife. She had seen the shadow in his eyes, the unspoken grief that he carried with him everywhere. But now, something else was surfacing: doubt. Emma's heart began to pound as the implications of her discovery took root. Could it be that Daniel had been involved in his wife's death? And if so, what did that mean for the man she had begun to care for? She had seen the pain he carried, but had it been the kind of pain that came from losing someone, or was it the kind that came from guilt? The thought was too chilling to ignore, and as she spent the night lying awake in the mansion's cold, empty silence, Emma could no longer deny that what she was uncovering might unravel everything she thought she knew about Daniel. It was the next day, as she moved through the familiar routine of dusting and sweeping, that Emma's thoughts finally reached a breaking point. The weight of the discovery was too much to bear, and she found herself standing in front of Daniel's office door, her hand hovering over the knob. It felt like a moment of reckoning, a moment that would change everything. She knew what she had to do, but the fear of what would happen next was paralyzing. Her mind raced as she tried to gather the words that would break the silence. She knew the gravity of the situation, knew that confronting him would either destroy the fragile connection they had or force them into a new, terrifying understanding of each other. Taking a deep breath, Emma pushed open the door. Daniel was there, his back to her, seemingly lost in thought. When he turned, there was no surprise in his eyes, only a cool detachment. But Emma couldn't hold back any longer. The words tumbled out before she could stop them, her voice trembling with the weight of what she was about to ask. "I found something about your wife, and I need to know the truth." Daniel's face darkened at the mention of his wife's name, and for a moment, Emma saw something flash in his eyes, something raw, something painful. The tension in the room was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken history. He didn't respond immediately, and the silence between them felt like a chasm. Emma's pulse quickened, but she stood her ground, determined to get the answer she needed. Daniel's jaw clenched, and Emma could see him fighting with himself, as if he were weighing whether to shut her out or to confront the demons he had buried for so long. Finally, his voice broke the silence, low and reluctant. "What you've read, it's not the whole story." His words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for a moment, Emma thought her heart might stop beating. She had been prepared for denial, for dismissal, but not this. Not this acknowledgement that the truth was far darker than she had ever imagined. She could see the internal struggle on his face, the war between keeping his secrets locked away and the desperate need to confess. The weight of his guilt was almost tangible. "What happened, Daniel?" Emma's voice cracked, and she hated herself for it. But the pain in his eyes made it impossible to remain cold and detached. "Tell me the truth." Daniel took a step forward, his face tight with emotion. The air between them felt charged, like a storm was about to break. For a long moment, he said nothing, his eyes searching hers as though trying to gauge whether she could handle the truth. And then, as if the dam had finally broken, he spoke. "It wasn't an accident," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "My wife, she wasn't killed in a robbery. She was murdered." The words echoed through the room, and Emma felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "I didn't mean for it to happen, but He stopped himself, his breath hitching as the confession spilled out. Emma's chest tightened with disbelief, and for a moment, she couldn't comprehend what she was hearing. But the look on his face, the rawness of his words, made it impossible to dismiss. Daniel continued, his voice breaking under the weight of his own guilt. "She had been having an affair. I found out, and I confronted her. And in that moment, in my anger and my hurt, I lost control. I never meant for her to die. I never meant for any of it to happen." Emma staggered back, her mind reeling. The truth was too much to process all at once. The man she had been getting to know, the man she had felt a growing connection with, had been responsible for the death of his wife. And yet, the pain in his eyes, the torment in his voice, made it clear that he was living with the consequences every day. Emma's heart ached for him, but there was also a deep, unsettling anger rising within her. He had taken a life he had vowed to protect, a life he had sworn to love, and now she was forced to reconcile the man standing before her with the man she had read about in the article. Emma stood in stunned silence, her mind a whirlpool of conflicting emotions. The weight of Daniel's confession crushed her chest, leaving her breathless, and the room seemed to close in around her. His words reverberated in her ears, a constant reminder of the dark truth that had been hidden from her all along. She had come to the mansion with a sense of purpose, to find answers about the man behind the cold, distant facade, but the answers she had uncovered had shattered everything she thought she knew. She tried to make sense of it all, but the pieces didn't fit together. The sympathy she had felt for Daniel, the empathy that had grown in the quiet moments they shared, now felt tainted by the terrible truth. Could she forgive him? Could she look at him the same way after learning what he had done? Daniel's face was contorted with remorse, his every feature etched with the pain of years spent running from his own guilt. His confession had torn open the wound he had kept so carefully hidden, and Emma saw the depth of his torment, how it had twisted him into the man he was today. "I've been living in a prison," he whispered, his voice hollow, devoid of any hope. "A prison of my own making. I've tried to run from it, tried to bury it, but it's always been there. The guilt, the regret, it never goes away. And now you know the truth." His words were heavy, each one a burden, as if he were offering up the last of his defenses. Emma's heart broke for him. She could see the toll this had taken on him. The years of self-imposed isolation, the emotional walls that had kept him locked away from everyone, even from himself. She wanted to reach out, to tell him that she understood, that people made mistakes. But the truth was, she wasn't sure she could forgive him. Not yet. Not until she understood more, until she had time to process everything he had said. Her mind kept flashing back to the image of his wife's death. The betrayal, the anger, the loss of control. It was one thing to make a mistake in the heat of the moment, but it was another thing entirely to take someone's life. She felt torn between her growing feelings for him and the horror of what he had done. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. Neither of them spoke, and the weight of the truth hung in the air like a suffocating fog. Emma's hands trembled, her emotions threatening to spill over. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to move forward from this. Her heart longed to reach out to him, to find some way to heal the wounds they both carried, but a part of her recoiled at the idea. Could she truly accept him for who he was? Could she ever look at him without seeing the ghost of his wife, the woman whose life he had taken? It was Daniel who broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted any of this. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I loved her, or at least I thought I did. But now I don't even know who I am anymore. I've spent so many years hiding from the truth, running from it, trying to convince myself it didn't happen. But it did, and I'll never be able to escape it. His eyes were hollow, a reflection of the man he had become, a man haunted by the past, trapped in a cycle of regret and self-loathing. Emma looked at him, her heart heavy with the weight of his confession. She wanted to reach out, to offer him some comfort, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She didn't know if she could ever offer him forgiveness. She didn't know if she could ever reconcile the man in front of her with the man she had come to know. And yet, there was a part of her that couldn't turn away. Despite everything, despite the darkness of his past, she couldn't ignore the vulnerability he had shown her. She had seen the cracks in his armor, the rawness of his pain, and it had touched something deep inside her. But love was complicated, and forgiveness was even more so. She didn't know what to do with the storm of emotions raging inside her. Daniel took a step back, his eyes filled with regret. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said quietly. I don't deserve forgiveness. I know that. But I needed you to know the truth. I needed to stop hiding from it. And I needed you to understand why I've been the way I am, why I've kept myself apart from everyone, why I've never allowed anyone to get too close. It's because of what I did. Because I couldn't bear the thought of anyone finding out. Emma closed her eyes, trying to block out the overwhelming flood of emotions threatening to drown her. She had come to this mansion, to this place of cold, sterile silence, in search of answers, but what she had found was something far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The man she had begun to care for was a murderer. But was he still the same man? Was he the person she had started to see behind the walls? The man who was capable of so much more than his guilt and isolation? Or was he forever defined by the terrible thing he had done? She looked at him, then really looked at him, and for the first time, she saw the brokenness in him. She saw the man who had been consumed by his own demons, the man who had lost everything and was now trapped in the very house that had once held the woman he had loved. There was no easy answer. There was no simple resolution to the mess of emotions swirling in her heart. But one thing was clear, whatever decision she made, it would change everything. She could no longer live in ignorance of his past. She had to decide whether she could continue to work for him, whether she could continue to be part of his world, knowing the truth. The silence stretched between them once more, thick and suffocating, as Emma stood there, torn between the man she had come to care for and the reality of what he had done. It felt like her entire world was shifting beneath her feet, and she didn't know which way to turn. Would she stay and try to understand, to help him heal from the wounds of his past? Or would she walk away, unable to reconcile his actions with the person he was now? With a deep, shaky breath, Emma finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to do, Daniel. I don't know if I can forgive you, but I need time. Time to process everything, time to figure out what I'm feeling. She paused, her heart aching as she looked into his eyes. But I can't be the one to fix this. I can't carry this burden for you. Daniel nodded, his face a mask of sorrow. I understand, he said quietly. Take all the time you need. I won't ask for forgiveness. but I'll give you whatever space you need. I'll never ask you to pretend everything's okay." And with those words, the emotional weight between them shifted, and Emma knew the road ahead would be a long, difficult one. She had to decide whether she could live with the truth and with the man who had confessed it to her, or whether she would have to walk away from the connection she had begun to form, leaving behind everything she had hoped for. The choice was hers, and it was a choice that would define her future. Emma's thoughts swirled with confusion as the hours passed after Daniel's confession. She had asked for time to process, but even in her quiet solitude, the weight of his words refused to leave her. Her emotions were in constant flux: guilt, anger, confusion, sympathy, all tangled together in a knot she could barely begin to untangle. There were moments when she found herself wanting to forgive him, to offer him the comfort he so clearly needed. But there were others when the truth of what he had done overwhelmed her, and the image of his wife's death would not leave her mind. Could she really look past such an atrocity? Could she ever forget? As the days passed, Emma became more distant, both physically and emotionally. She went through the motions of her work, cleaning the vast rooms of the mansion, but her mind was never fully present. Every corner of the house seemed to carry an echo of what she had learned. The walls, once so cold and intimidating, now felt oppressive in a different way. The silence in the mansion was suffocating, a constant reminder of the dark truth that loomed over everything. She found herself staring at the portraits of Daniel's ancestors, their stoic faces forever frozen in time. How many secrets had this house held over the years? How many lives had been altered by choices made in these very halls? Despite the heaviness in her chest, Emma couldn't ignore the pull she still felt toward Daniel. It was a strange, uncomfortable attraction, a pull toward his vulnerability, his pain. But she also feared the danger of becoming too attached. She had already seen how fragile the line was between empathy and self-destruction. She couldn't afford to let herself fall deeper into a situation that was so fraught with complications. Yet, every time she crossed paths with him, her heart ached. His sorrow was palpable, and it stirred something inside her, something both kind and broken. She knew what it felt like to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, to live in constant fear of losing everything. Maybe that was why she couldn't turn away from him, because in some strange way, she understood his pain, but understanding didn't make it easier. She knew she had to make a decision that would impact her life and her future. She thought of her brother, her responsibility to him, and his worsening health. She couldn't let herself get lost in Daniel's world, no matter how tempting it was to stay. Her brother needed her. Her life outside the mansion needed her. She couldn't afford to lose herself in someone else's tragedy, no matter how much she wanted to help. Yet, in her heart, she knew that leaving wasn't as simple as just walking away. The emotional connection between her and Daniel had deepened, and as much as she wanted to shut it all out, she couldn't ignore it. The time she spent with him, the brief moments of conversation, the silent exchanges that spoke volumes, had become a lifeline. There was something between them that neither could deny. Something raw, something real, but that didn't change the fact that Daniel's past was dark, and his sins were unforgivable to many. Could she really build a future with someone like him? Someone who had committed such an unforgivable act? Could love overcome guilt, betrayal, and violence? Emma's internal conflict grew as she sat alone in her small apartment one evening, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. The thought of leaving the mansion and everything that had begun to change within her felt like a loss. She thought about the quiet moments when Daniel had seemed almost human, when the walls around him had cracked just enough to let her see the man he could have been. She could feel her heart ache for him, even as her mind screamed at her to walk away. She didn't know if she could forgive him, but she didn't know if she could leave him either. She picked up the phone to check on her brother, as she did every evening. His voice brought her back to reality, grounding her in the life she had built outside the mansion. The conversation was brief, but it reminded her of the obligations she still had. Her brother needed her more than ever, and Emma couldn't forget that. She had spent so many years taking care of him, trying to balance the impossible expectations of her life. She couldn't let the pain of Daniel's past distract her from her responsibilities. But at the same time, her thoughts kept drifting back to the mansion, to Daniel's confession, and to the man she had come to care for despite the darkness that shadowed him. Would he ever find peace with himself? Could he ever heal from the deep scars he carried? And more importantly, could she help him? Could she be the one to help him find redemption, even if it meant risking everything? The thought terrified her. The stakes were too high. If she allowed herself to get too close, she might lose herself in his pain, just as he had lost himself in his own. The idea of falling in love with him, only to be consumed by the ghosts of his past, was too much to bear. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this decision wasn't just about Daniel or his past. It was about her. It was about what she could live with and what she couldn't. It was about whether she could allow herself to forgive, not just him, but herself for caring, for feeling. The next morning, Emma made up her mind. She couldn't keep living in the shadow of the past. She couldn't keep running from the truth. It was time to confront Daniel, to look him in the eye and tell him what she had decided. The decision wasn't easy, and she knew it would hurt. But sometimes, the hardest decisions were the ones that shaped the future. As she entered the mansion that morning, she felt a sense of finality settle over her. The familiar hallways, the polished floors, the portraits staring down at her. All of it had become a part of her journey. But now, she had to take the next step. She had to move forward, whatever that meant. She had to face Daniel one last time and tell him that she couldn't stay. It wasn't because she didn't care. It was because she did. Because sometimes love meant letting go. As she walked up the stairs to his study, her heart beat faster with each step. This was the moment of truth. Would he understand? Would he let her go? Or would he fight for her? She didn't know. But she knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, she couldn't keep living in the past. The future was hers to create, and she had to start living for herself, not for the ghosts of what had been. The days after the confrontation left Emma in an emotional whirlwind. The heaviness of Daniel's confession sat on her chest like an anchor, pulling her deeper into a sea of confusion and grief. The man she had come to care for, the man she had started to trust, had committed an unthinkable act, and now she was left to reconcile the person she thought he was with the reality of his past. Her emotions became a tangled mess of empathy, disgust, guilt, and anger. Each passing day seemed to blur together, with the mansion's imposing walls feeling more suffocating than ever. The weight of his words was too much for her to bear in silence, and so she retreated into herself, isolating her thoughts from the world around her. She would spend hours pacing through the rooms, lost in her own head, wrestling with the decision she knew she had to make. Should she expose him? Should she leave and never look back? But what would that achieve? Would it bring her peace? Or would it push her further into a void of loneliness and uncertainty? The emotional turmoil was unbearable, and as much as she tried to compartmentalize her feelings, they all inevitably merged into Emma's trust in Daniel, once a solid foundation, had started to crumble, piece by piece. She had seen the man behind the public mask, witnessed his vulnerability and the immense sorrow that weighed on him. And yet, in the wake of his confession, she couldn't ignore the moral dilemma that had surfaced. Should she continue working for someone with a dark history? Could she ever look at him the same way again, knowing the true nature of his actions? Could she continue to be emotionally attached to someone who had done something so monstrous, even if he was now a broken man trying to seek redemption? She thought of her own family, her brother's deteriorating health, and the promises she had made to care for him. She couldn't afford to lose herself in someone else's tragedy, especially not one as consuming as Daniel's. And yet a part of her didn't want to let go. A part of her was drawn to him, to his suffering, to the shared pain that she couldn't quite explain. As much as she knew that staying in the mansion, staying near Daniel, could only lead to more heartache, a piece of her, small as it may be, wanted to help him heal, just as she had always tried to help her brother heal. But at what cost? As she grappled with these emotions, memories of her own past began to resurface, memories she had long buried deep within herself. The fractured relationship she had with her parents, the abandonment, the lack of emotional support. These things had shaped her, just as Daniel's own history had shaped him. She had spent years trying to suppress the pain of her childhood, the neglect, the feeling of being invisible. But now, in the midst of everything she was facing, she couldn't avoid the truth any longer. She saw the parallels between her life and Daniel's, the way their wounds ran so deep that they both struggled to trust, to connect with anyone, let alone with each other. The realization was both painful and comforting. They shared something that was intangible but undeniable. They were two people broken by their pasts, trying to navigate a world that had never truly given them the chance to heal. And in that shared pain, Emma found herself being drawn closer to Daniel, despite every instinct telling her to walk away. She wasn't sure whether it was empathy, guilt, or something deeper, but she couldn't help feeling that, in some way, their suffering had intertwined in a way that made it almost impossible to untangle. The tension continued to build between them, and Daniel, in his own misguided way, tried to make amends. He showered her with extravagant gifts, paid off her brother's medical bills without her asking, and offered luxuries she couldn't have dreamed of. But Emma saw through his gestures. She knew what they were, attempts to buy her forgiveness, to assuage the guilt that ate at him. His actions were kind, yes, but they lacked depth. There was no emotional connection, no real understanding behind them. It was as if Daniel believed that material things could heal the wounds of the past, that money and gifts could fix what had been broken. But Emma wasn't fooled. She felt manipulated, like a pawn in a game he was playing to protect his own conscience. His actions, while seemingly generous, only served to push her further away. She didn't need his money. She didn't need his grand gestures. What she needed was the truth, the real truth, and she wasn't sure Daniel was capable of giving her that. It was the emotional depth that was missing, and it was that absence that kept her at arm's length. Emma began to realize that, despite all his remorse, Daniel was still running from his past, still trying to cover up the mess he had made with material comforts rather than confront the emotional wreckage he had left in his wake. As if the emotional turmoil weren't enough, Emma's personal life took a heartbreaking turn when her brother's health worsened. What had once been a gradual decline now escalated to a crisis. The doctors were vague, and the future seemed uncertain. Emma found herself torn between two worlds. She needed to be there for her brother, to offer him the support and care that only she could provide. But she also had obligations to the mansion, to Daniel, and to herself. The weight of her responsibilities grew heavier with each passing day. How could she continue to balance her devotion to her brother with her commitment to a man who was, at best, a complicated mess of guilt and unhealed wounds? The decision was agonizing, but after much internal struggle, Emma made the difficult choice to take a leave of absence from the mansion. She needed to be with her brother, to focus on the one thing that had always been certain in her life: family. The decision was a turning point. It was a moment of clarity, of understanding that no matter how much she had come to care for Daniel, no matter how deeply her heart ached for him, her family's well-being had to come first. And with that, Emma pulled herself away, creating the distance she so desperately needed to regain control of her life. As Emma distanced herself from the mansion and from Daniel, she found herself enveloped in a strange sense of relief. The constant tug-of-war between her feelings for Daniel and her sense of duty to her brother had worn her thin. Now, with her focus fully on her brother's deteriorating health, she could breathe for the first time in weeks. However, her peace was short-lived. Daniel's actions, though seemingly kind, remained in the back of her mind, continuing to haunt her. He had taken control of the situation with her brother's care, arranging top-tier medical assistance, but his gesture felt like a chain wrapped around her wrist. Though she was grateful for the help, she couldn't ignore the discomfort that settled in her chest. His interference, though well-intended, felt manipulative. By paying for her brother's medical bills, Daniel had removed the financial burden from her shoulders. But in doing so, he had also inserted himself into the most vulnerable aspect of her life, attempting to dictate her choices under the guise of generosity. She was no longer in control, and the realization that Daniel saw himself as a savior in her life made her uncomfortable. She didn't want to be indebted to him, didn't want to feel like he was using her brother's illness as leverage to keep her tethered to him. Emma's thoughts were chaotic as she tried to reconcile her feelings. She had always valued her independence and autonomy, and now Daniel's seemingly benevolent actions felt like a subtle form of control. She didn't need him to fix everything for her, didn't need him to step in as the knight in shining armor. What she needed, what she craved, was understanding, genuine emotional support, and trust. She needed to feel that her decisions, no matter how difficult, were her own. Instead, Daniel's interference made her feel cornered. It wasn't just the gesture itself, but the way it made her feel seen as incapable of handling her own life. It hurt her pride, but it also caused a deeper sense of discomfort that she couldn't ignore. The tension between gratitude and resentment grew, and soon, Emma could no longer keep her feelings to herself. Her emotions reached a breaking point. She had been silent for too long, absorbing everything in an attempt to protect her heart and maintain a semblance of control over her life. But Daniel's actions, his repeated attempts to control the narrative, pushed her to the edge. She needed to confront him, to voice the anger and frustration that had been building inside her. And so, one afternoon, when Daniel came to visit her brother at the hospital under the guise of offering support, Emma could no longer hold back. The moment he walked into the room, she felt her emotions surge. The raw anger that had been simmering bubbled to the surface, and she confronted him head-on. Her words were sharp, cutting through the silence with an intensity that took Daniel by surprise. "You think you can just fix everything with your money and your grand gestures," she snapped, unable to hold back the bitterness that seeped into her voice. "You don't get to buy me, Daniel. You don't get to buy my forgiveness or my trust. You've manipulated me, used my brother's health to keep me tied to you. I'm not your charity case." The room seemed to freeze, and for a moment, Daniel stood there, stunned, unable to respond. It was the first time Emma had truly let herself speak her mind, and it felt like a release, a cathartic moment where she no longer had to suppress her feelings for fear of alienating him. She could see the hurt in his eyes as she spoke, but there was also a flicker of guilt and recognition. He had been trying to fix everything with his money, but he had never stopped to consider how his actions were making her feel. For the first time, Emma saw him for what he truly was: vulnerable, flawed, and deeply human. He wasn't the man who could solve all her problems. He was the man who had caused so much pain, and he was still trying to hide behind his attempts to make amends. But Emma could no longer tolerate the facade. She had been trying to make sense of him, trying to justify his actions, and find some trace of the man she once thought he was. But now, in this moment, she realized she could no longer excuse his behavior. The truth was out in the open, raw and unrelenting, and Emma knew that she had to make a choice. Could she ever truly forgive him for what he had done, or would she walk away from the man who had caused so much devastation in both their lives? Daniel, for his part, looked as though her words had struck him deeply. He opened his mouth to respond, but for once, the words didn't come easily. His usual defenses, the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself, seemed to crumble before her. For the first time, he was forced to face the emotional consequences of his actions. Not as a wealthy man trying to buy redemption, but as a broken soul who had destroyed everything he loved. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with the weight of years of emotional neglect and unresolved guilt. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice low and filled with regret. "I never meant to hurt you," he admitted, his eyes searching hers for any trace of forgiveness. "I thought if I could fix everything with money, it would be enough. But I see now. I've been wrong all along. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make it right." Emma's anger faded slightly, replaced by a deep sadness that seemed to settle in her chest. She had always known that Daniel was broken in ways that went beyond his actions. He had tried to use material things to fix what couldn't be fixed with anything but time, understanding, and a willingness to face the truth of his own guilt. Emma knew that she wasn't the one who could save him. She had tried, but she couldn't carry his burden alone. She had her own life to manage, her own struggles to face. And as much as she cared for him, she realized that some wounds were too deep to heal, and some relationships were too damaged to salvage. She didn't know what the future held for them, but she understood that their relationship, What it had been was over. There was no going back from this. Emma stood there, her heart aching as she listened to Daniel's words, the heaviness of the silence pressing down on them. The air between them was thick with unspoken emotions, a tangled mess of regret, guilt, and unfulfilled needs. Her mind raced, torn between the love she had once felt for him and the raw, undeniable truth of what had transpired. She wanted to believe that the man standing before her, this broken, remorseful figure, could somehow find redemption. But the damage had been done. She had been hurt in ways that no apology or grand gesture could undo. She could see it now, the cracks in his armor, the vulnerability that had always been hidden beneath his arrogance and coldness. Daniel wasn't just a man haunted by the past. He was a man who had never truly known how to live in the present, never understood how to forge meaningful connections. His wealth, his power, his ability to manipulate situations. It had all been a smokescreen, a way to shield himself from the rawness of human relationships, from the very thing he had lacked all his life, genuine emotional intimacy. But even as Emma stood there, her heart torn between empathy and self-preservation, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep trying to save him. She couldn't keep sacrificing herself, her own sense of identity, in the hope that one day he might change. Change didn't come through empty promises or superficial acts of kindness. It came through hard, painful work, and Daniel had never truly been willing to do that for himself, let alone for her. Emma had been so focused on trying to fix what had been broken between them that she had neglected her own needs. She had put aside her own dreams, her own well-being, in an attempt to heal his wounds. But in doing so, she had lost sight of who she was. And now, standing in front of him, she realized that she couldn't afford to lose herself any longer. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quieter than she expected, trembling with the weight of her decision. "I can't do this anymore, Daniel. I can't keep trying to save you. I have to let go." Her words felt like a punch to her own chest, each syllable heavier than the last. But they were the truth. The painful, inevitable truth. Daniel's face tightened, the flicker of anguish in his eyes a reflection of the man he had always been, afraid of losing, afraid of facing the consequences of his actions. He reached out, his hand tentative, almost pleading, but Emma stepped back, the physical distance reflecting the emotional chasm that had grown between them. She could see the shock in his eyes, the hurt, but also something else, a glimmer of understanding. He didn't want to lose her, but in the end, he had already lost her. His actions had driven her away long before this moment. The betrayal, the manipulation, the lies, they had all chipped away at the foundation of what had once been. And now, there was nothing left to hold on to. "Emma, please." Daniel's voice cracked, desperation creeping into his tone. "I know I've messed up. I know I've hurt you. But I'm trying. I'm trying to change. I'm sorry, Daniel." She interrupted, her voice soft but firm. "I can't be part of this anymore. I can't keep waiting for you to change, for you to fix things that can't be fixed. I have to move on. I have to take care of myself and my family. And that doesn't include you." The finality of her words hung in the air, a silence that neither of them could fill. Emma felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, but at the cost of something she had once held dear. The love she had for him had been real, but it had been overshadowed by the darkness of his past, the unresolved guilt that had been festering inside him for years. She could no longer bear the burden of his brokenness, no matter how much she wanted to help him heal. Daniel stood motionless, his expression unreadable, as if her words had knocked the wind out of him. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Emma didn't know if he was processing the enormity of what had just transpired, or if he was simply too devastated to respond. Either way, it didn't matter. She had made her decision. She couldn't keep sacrificing herself for someone who wasn't ready to face his own demons. Without waiting for his reply, Emma turned and walked away. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the hallway, a quiet reminder that the chapter of her life with Daniel was now closed. She didn't look back. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Emma felt a sense of clarity. She had chosen herself. She had chosen to reclaim her life, to take back the control that had slipped away from her. And no matter what happened next, she knew that she was stronger for it. As she walked through the mansion, the weight of the past lifted with each step. The mansion, which had once felt like a prison, now seemed like a distant memory. Emma was leaving behind the person she had been, someone defined by the choices of others, someone who had allowed herself to be caught in a web of guilt, manipulation, and fear. She was walking away from the past and into the unknown, ready to face whatever came next with courage and conviction. And as she stepped out into the world beyond the mansion's gates, Emma knew that the hardest part was over. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. Emma sat quietly, reflecting on the emotional roller coaster she had endured over the past few months. The mansion, once a symbol of her confusion and pain, now felt different. It was as though the walls themselves had absorbed her struggles, and with each passing day, they were being replaced with the quiet hum of possibility. She had faced so many hard truths about herself, about Daniel, and about the way she had allowed herself to become entangled in a web of guilt, fear, and resentment. The truth about Daniel had shattered her, and yet, as she looked back, she realized that her journey had also forced her to face the deepest parts of herself. In many ways, she had grown stronger. Emma had learned to love herself again, to forgive herself for the parts of her that had been complicit in her own suffering. She had learned that forgiveness wasn't just about letting someone else off the hook. It was about releasing herself from the weight of anger and bitterness that had held her captive for too long. Letting go of the past wasn't easy, but in that moment, as she stood on the precipice of her future, she understood that forgiveness was a choice that she could make for herself, not for anyone else. She thought about Daniel, the man who had caused her so much pain, but also the man who had begun to show signs of real change. It hadn't come easily for him, but through his own struggle, he had slowly started to peel back the layers of his guilt and pride. He had entered therapy, he had faced the darkness of his own soul, and in doing so, he had begun to rebuild himself piece by painful piece. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was a beginning, a starting point from which they could build something new together. Daniel's transformation wasn't perfect, far from it. But Emma could see the sincerity in his efforts now. She could feel it in the way he no longer tried to control her with his gestures, in the way he was finally starting to respect her as an equal. They were both on a journey, each working through their own pasts, each grappling with their own demons. But what mattered now was that they were doing it side by side. They had learned to communicate differently, to listen to each other's needs, to build trust in a way that wasn't based on manipulation or fear. Their relationship was evolving, and though they both still carried scars from the past, there was a shared understanding between them now, a deeper connection that hadn't existed before. The challenges weren't over. There were still shadows from Daniel's past lurking, still external pressures that threatened to tear them apart. His former business partner, a man who had tried to sabotage Daniel's career for years, resurfaced with intentions to destroy everything Daniel had worked for. The tension between them flared up again, forcing both Emma and Daniel to confront their deepest fears. Emma had to decide whether to stand by him or walk away, terrified that she might be pulled back into the cycles of manipulation and emotional turmoil that had once defined their relationship. But this time, something was different. She didn't feel as though she was being dragged into something against her will. This time, Emma was choosing to face the storm with him, not out of obligation, but because she had seen the man Daniel was becoming. They had learned to confront their insecurities and doubts, to trust that their love, however fragile, was worth fighting for. And together, they faced the external conflict head-on, proving to themselves that they could overcome the obstacles that life continued to throw at them. It was in the aftermath of that crisis that the true healing began. Emma, Daniel, and her brother, who had recovered thanks to Daniel's intervention, found themselves sitting together in the mansion, a space that had once been filled with secrets, guilt, and pain. Now, it was a symbol of the growth they had all undergone. The mansion was no longer a prison. It had become a place of peace. Emma and Daniel shared a quiet moment of reflection, understanding that they had both come so far from where they had started. They had learned that healing wasn't a destination, It was an ongoing process. Forgiveness, like love, was something that had to be practiced every day. Emma realized that her journey with Daniel wasn't about perfection. It was about progress, about learning to love each other through the mess of life, through the failures and the triumphs, through the moments of weakness and strength. Her brother's recovery was more than just a physical healing. It was a symbol of everything they had fought for, everything they had endured. It was a testament to the power of love, the power of second chances, and the power of family. In that moment, Emma felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She no longer felt defined by the pain of the past. Instead, she felt like she was finally stepping into the future, a future full of possibility, full of hope, and full of love. As Emma and Daniel stood together, hand in hand, they shared a look of quiet understanding. They both knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be setbacks, there would be moments of doubt, but they were no longer defined by the mistakes they had made. They had learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about embracing it, learning from it, and using it as a foundation for something better. Daniel expressed his deep gratitude to Emma, acknowledging the courage it had taken for her to forgive him, to trust him again, and to give him the chance to prove that he could be worthy of her love. He promised her that he would continue to work on himself, that he would never take her forgiveness for granted. And as they stood together, their brother by their side, the mansion around them felt like home. It was no longer a place of isolation and sorrow. It was a place where healing had occurred, where love had been rekindled, and where the future was theirs to shape. The scars of the past would always remain, but they no longer held power over them. Emma, Daniel, and her brother were ready to face whatever the future held, not as broken people, but as individuals who had learned to love and forgive, to heal and grow, to move forward together. And with that, the door to the future swung wide open, ready to welcome them into the unknown, where new beginnings awaited.